Hello, everybody. And hello to everyone announcing themselves in the chat. Welcome. So welcome, everybody. We are at lesson 4, which is on irrigation. This is probably one of the most significant kind of lessons and topics dealing with native plant horticulture, and is one of the most challenging for people sometimes to grasp. Oh, let's mute everybody. There we go. Irrigating native plants can be one of the more challenging aspects, not because it itself is particularly challenging, but it requires the most unlearning of conventional garden practice in order to do it right. And so it's one of those factors that leads probably to the highest number of native plant fatalities, more than any other aspect of native plant gardening. So more than technique of planting itself, more than placement, more than weeds or pests or anything like that, probably irrigation has the most number of issues related to it. And again, it's not because native plants are particularly hard, but because we have to deprogram ourselves from a certain type of irrigation mentality when we plant with native plants. So I'm hoping that the goal of this class is going to be a little bit less about giving you exact formulas to use with regards to plants, and more about sending you home with the right instinct, because with the right instinct you can tailor your irrigation practice to particular settings, and you don't have this kind of cookie cutter approach where somehow it's going to be one size fits all, because that's usually not realistic or successful. And so the instinct for me is kind of where I want to get everybody kind of up to speed. So hello everyone who's saying that they're here. Hello, hello, hello. Thank you. The other thing I want to announce, for those of you who have not already done it, tomorrow is the first in-person workshop. It will be taking place at Tree People's headquarters at Coldwater Canyon. So that, if you have not signed up already and you want to sign up, the email that you received this Zoom link in, your main kind of contact email for this class, has links to both the irrigation workshop, which is tomorrow, and the pruning workshop, which is in 2 weeks' time, both on Saturdays. And so if you want to participate in that tomorrow, there's 2 time slots. There is an 8:30 and there is a 10:30, and they're each an hour and a half long, I believe. 8:30 to 9, yeah, 8:30 to 10, and then 10:30 to 12. So this is a really good opportunity if you wanted to see kind of native plants in the ground, maybe plant one with me. We talk irrigation, we look at some different irrigation strategies. Tree People has a really cool kind of example of how to use rainwater from the roof and incorporate that into a landscape. And so we get to kind of just talk about all these kinds of components of irrigating a landscape, but also just other questions. We can talk about kind of right plant, right place, and some of the other things that we've kind of touched on, plant ID and things like that. So if you think that you would benefit from that kind of an in-person opportunity, and also to get to see me in person, fantastic, feel free to sign up for the class on that link in the email that Brenda sent out, I believe. And if anybody didn't get that for any let's see. Sorry, I'm reading here in the chat. George is asking, would you teach fee-based pruning class if we can't make it tomorrow but still want to learn down the road? Well, the pruning workshop will be in 2 weeks. The irrigation workshop will be tomorrow. So if you have an opportunity 2 weeks from now to take the pruning, then you know that's an opportunity. If you can't, I sometimes teach native plant maintenance classes and such, which largely deal with pruning at Theodore Payne, and they have a year-round schedule of maintenance courses that they offer throughout the year. It could be, you know, me teaching it conceivably, or it could be one of their kind of landscape technicians teaching it. And so I would highly recommend taking one of those classes. And yeah, it would be fee-based, and you just go onto their Eventbrite page and just sign up based on, you know, the time and the schedule that works for you. Alexis asks, is there anything to bring to the workshop? No, just yourself and your questions if you have any. There's nothing really that you would need, I don't think. We have a few people in the class today, and just generally who are part of this cohort who work at Tree People. And so I think if there's something that's needed, if we need a shovel or a hose or something like that, then they will offer it to us so that we can play around in their dirt. So you don't really need to bring anything. If you want to bring a notepad or something, if something I utter some pure wisdom and brilliance and you want to jot it down, you're welcome to, but otherwise just yourselves is good enough. All right. So an official welcome. Hello again. Welcome to irrigation workshop number 4, lesson number 4. And so what we are going to do before we dive into the lesson, however, is to review the homework. So I did again, thank you all for sending me your homework. It was awesome. I love seeing all the photos, and especially those of you who kind of went more in depth with some of the soil testing. It was mainly just like an infiltration and a kind of a texture test. Some of you even went above and beyond, also did a jar test to kind of supplement that, and really wanted to do a real in-depth kind of dive into the soil. And one of you also put a historical photo from the site prior to development and kind of like cross compared it to what it is now. So that was really cool. Another layer to it that I wasn't expecting. So thank you all so much for doing so well. On that, I apologize for not this round responding individually to all of you, but I did read every single one, including the ones that just came in right before the class. So you guys got it in the nick of time, and they were all very, very excellent. And so I want to just kind of go over a few samples again, like we've been doing, just sharing some of the student work. So this was wonderfully interactive, as you can tell. So we had this participant in the class dig their perfect 1x1 hole. During the time that it was filled with soil, they did a soil test and kind of created this long ribbon, which measured, I believe in this case, like more than 3 inches. Yeah, more than 3 inches. So if you remember, generally, if it doesn't break up really soon, more than 3 inches would mean that this has got a lot of clay in it. And so this is more of that same person's work. This is the image with the hole filled, and this is the image with the hole drained. It took 1 hour and 15 minutes to accomplish the full drain. And in a dish soap and water jar test, this student found that it was about 2/3 this cloudy clay, and the rest of it silt with very little sand. So even in this scenario, however, 1 hour and 15 minutes is, we would say that that is heavy soil, but it's not the worst it could possibly be. There are some that take 3 hours, some that might take a whole day. So 1 hour and 15 minutes is still pretty doable, and you still have a real big range of plants that will survive and thrive in that kind of condition. So this isn't in any way kind of like a hopeless situation, or clay in this scenario isn't a death sentence for many of the plants. So it seems like this is going to be still really, really workable site. Next, whoops, nope, didn't want that. Go back to read mode. Okay, so this was a nice contrast. So I wanted to highlight this because you see in two scenarios, one, the hole itself drained in 12 minutes. So that's really wonderfully fast. That's less than 15 minutes. Is pretty darn impressive. And you can see on the right a real great close-up of exactly what kind of soil this is. And you can see it's really gritty. It's really sandy. And so you have this might be more like DG or decomposed granite, depending on kind of the site and where it's at. And so this is going to be your fast drainage kind of soil that most native plants are going to be thriving in. Very few native plants require clay. They are more like just tolerant of it. And most native plants really do love this really quick draining soil. You can also see that the grittiness means there's a lot more pore space, right, for the roots to be able to go through and penetrate. A lot more pore space for water to be able to go through fast, which is why it drained in 12 minutes instead of an hour and 15. So this is just a really nice contrast example. And this is another one where we have kind of something right in between the two. So this is more like a sandy clay loam, so a nice kind of like combo. She did two test sites. One of them drained in 30 minutes. Oh, two tests and two holes. So yeah, she was pretty thorough. And I guess it was on the same site, I believe. And so not huge difference between the two. These are all still considered, you know, either sandy or loamy soils. So with pretty good drainage, not as fast as the previous one, but not as slow as the previous one before that. And so you again are going to have a lot of really good options to plant in this kind of soil and not really have to worry too much about getting plants that are going to be adapted to heavy conditions or heavy soil conditions. So I just wanted to kind of highlight those three as kind of good examples of some of your work, but also just good three different examples based on slow and fast and right in between. All right. Okay, so for lesson 4, the objectives of this lesson, we're hoping that you can define a garden's, oh, let me see the apostrophe there. I will fix that later. Garden's irrigation need based on the age of the garden, plant material, your kind of irrigation system, and soil type. So your irrigation needs are going to be changing depending on all those things, and to be able to customize an irrigation plan for that is something we're hoping that you develop that instinct for after this class. Scheduling irrigation to mimic the seasons, which in particular would mean wet winters and during drought years, especially during that time. And then also changing the irrigation plan as the garden matures. So you don't have the same irrigation plan in year 1 as you do in year 2 and 3 and 4 and 5. So understanding the difference between establishment watering and maintenance watering. Those are two different types of watering strategies. And so we need you to kind of understand, how do we set the plant up for success during the establishment period? And how do we change that kind of strategy afterwards? So, okay. So California native plants in cultivated landscapes, for the most part, the majority of the plants that you are going to be seeing and working with from either chaparral, coastal sage scrub, oak woodland, are biggest the options as far as the availability in the nurseries, but also the ones that tend to do the best in most Southern California gardens. If you're not from Southern California, you might also see similar kinds of plant communities where you're at. But if you're somewhere where the irrigation levels are really, really high, or you come from a place of pretty extreme snow, you might have a different palette of plants that you're working with. But most of the people in this cohort are planting in Southern California in some of these plant communities or comparable plant communities. And they're buying from nurseries that generally have the bulk of their plants from these kinds of communities. California also has areas of plants, right? Streamside plants. We showed that really excellent example of the juncus Juncus textilis, which is that basket rush, and it was planted at a natural stream. And so that is an example of a riparian plant planted in the exact place that it should be. Whereas if you planted, say, a manzanita right in a natural stream, you would kill it. And so that's the understanding that there are certain plants that are maybe riparian in nature that have comparable places where they should be planted, and also some where they shouldn't be. That's all part of this kind of irrigation strategy. Also redwood forest plant communities, coastal strands, some of these other ones have very different irrigation strategies. They require much more water if you're planting those plants from that community in Southern California that are, don't necessarily come from forested environments. So understanding where the plant comes from is kind of your big clue and key. You want to be able to mimic or approximate what that plant would get from nature in a good year. So not get from nature in a horrible drought year, but what would they get from nature in a good year? And that's what we're trying to mimic. So factors influencing irrigation needs, they depend on a few things. They depend on abiotic as well as biotic factors. So as far as abiotic or non-living kind of background contextual factors, you want to think about the soil texture type. So we already talked about infiltration and how important that is. We saw that sandy soil has larger pore space. The water infiltrates faster, but it also will dry out faster. Clay doesn't infiltrate as quickly, but when it does, it kind of gets sticky and stays there for a long time, so it doesn't evaporate as quickly. So those are all factors that influence how often we want to irrigate our landscape. Light, shade, heat, and wind. If you have a shady condition, say trees, evergreen tree is covering the garden and it's in the shade, that's going to reduce your water needs, right? Because if the sun is not hitting the ground directly, not as much water is evaporating. Which means that you can go longer between watering. So that really matters. Heat as well, obviously, the more heat there is, the more evaporation there is. Wind will also take moisture out of plants and out of the soil. So those are all really important things to consider at a site. Is this place always windy? Are we going to water because we're anticipating a windy condition? Is this always in the shade, and how do we make those adjustments? So that's another kind of contextual kind of abiotic factor that's going to influence how you irrigate. And then topography or aspect also is something. So how the land is shaped and where the plants or garden, landscape is in relation to that matters. So a north-facing slope is generally shadier, just like a north-facing part of a house is the shadiest part of your house. The south facing is the hottest, most blasting part of your house. West facing is in the shade in the morning, but then blasted by the afternoon sun. And east facing is in the shade in the afternoon, but gets the morning sun. And so that again will influence what plants you plant and how you water them. And then also whether you're having it like in a canyon or there's a slope, because that will affect. So canyons will kind of like collect water in the canyon, or they might be shadier, and on a slope water will run off. And so depending on how you're irrigating, that can affect whether the ground is receiving the water or not. As far as living or dynamic factors, we're talking about biotic factors now. Plant water uptake and transpiration, just generally speaking, how the plant takes water. So some plants that are super thirsty require a different kind of water strategy than some plants that are not. Plants that live inside water, right, like a juncus, is going to be different than the manzanita, for instance. So the age of the plant and canopy cover. So once the garden is full, the watering is going to be very different than when you just have these like teeny tiny plants in a sea of mulch baking hot in the sun. So when in the very beginning, there will not be very much water efficiency. You're going to be watering the plants a lot to get them established, number one. And number two, they don't have the benefit of kind of that ground covering quality of having been grown in yet. And so you might find yourself getting a lot more, evaporation in the beginning. In fact, there's a little thing here. It says establishing a garden, the establishment phase, that's year one, pretty much. The establishment phase takes almost as much water as a turf garden, meaning just a regular lawn irrigated garden. So don't be surprised if your clients do not see water savings in their first year. Don't count on water savings in year one. If you're doing maybe a turf reduction or removal, you're doing the rebate, or you're just doing it for water savings long term, don't expect to see a drought tolerant garden in year one. Your year one is going to be much more heavy on water, but it's going to be done in a particular way that's not the same as turf. You're not going to water it 3 times a week for 5 minutes. But like when you add it up, it's going to be probably around the same amount of water that you've used in year one. Year 2, year 3, you're going to drastically reduce it to the point that you're going to see water savings make up for that very, very soon. And then mulch will help keep water in the soil once it's there, but you may have to apply extra irrigation to get through that mulch layer. So something that if you didn't have mulch, you can put less water because it's going to hit the soil and then get absorbed pretty quickly. But with the mulch, you kind of have the mulch itself gets wet and then the soil will get wet. And so you might have to consider adding extra. So this is kind of a chart. I authored this chart and I did it because I wanted to, again, help develop that instinct that I was talking about, more so than create some strict rule or guide. If you look at the arrow down here, this is a very basic guide, not to be used as an absolute rule. Local conditions such as soil type, sun and shade conditions and such will affect the schedule. But what I do want to impart is this understanding of the first year establishment watering schedule and what that means. This chart is in your student handbook. So it's in your either virtual, online version or your actual hard copy. So the way that this chart works is this is by planting season. Okay, so if you plant in the fall, generally speaking, you can expect to water deeply about once a week. Then that following winter, it's going to be once every 2 weeks or less, depending on the rain. So think about what happens between fall and winter. The winter starts getting cooler, so you don't have the water lasts longer. It doesn't evaporate as quickly. So you extend your watering, the time between waterings. Then in spring, now the plant's been in the ground for almost half a year. In the spring, you're going to keep it to like every 2 weeks, summer every 2 weeks, the following fall. So it's already been a whole fall, then once a month or less. So how does that change if you do a winter planting? And again, when I say once a week, maybe it's once every 2 weeks if fall is super, super cool and wet, or maybe it's once every 5 days or every 4 days if it's like 100 degrees in the fall. So when I say this, I want you to see the trend more so than think that, oh, it has to be every 7 days. So think of the trend. The trend is that we're trying to get the plants to grow deep, deep roots. And the way to do that is to water it deeply and less frequently over time, to the point that they've developed such deep roots that they can go longer and longer and longer without water, because that's how we train them to become drought tolerant. So in the little pots, they're not drought tolerant yet, even though genetically they're drought tolerant. They are not drought tolerant until you've trained them to do that. So this is more like a training schedule based on season of planting. So in the winter, remember, cool and wet, you'll probably be watering once every 2 weeks or less, depending on the weather. So if it's like really rainy, you might not water for 2 months. And then the following spring, once every 2 weeks, summer, once every 2 weeks, fall, once every 2 weeks or less, following winter, once a month or less. In the spring, again, back to once a week because it's going to be warm. Summer, once a week, because the plants haven't been in the ground for very long. They haven't even been in the ground for half a year. So you can't jump to once every 2 weeks necessarily yet, right? Because it's hot and even hotter. So you're going to kind of stick to once a week. But then by fall, they've been in the ground for 6 months. You can start to push them once every 2 weeks. Winter, once a month or less because it's so cool and hopefully rainy, and then once a month or less again. And then a summer planting is the challenging one because again, it's super hot. So depending if you have that drains in 12-minute kind of sandy soil and it's 115 degrees, you might have to water every day, not every 4 to 5 days. But the idea is that you're going to be watering more frequently when you first get them in. So I gave an overall estimate of every 4 to 5 days. And then in the fall, once a week, you'll stretch it out to once a week. In the winter, every 2 weeks or less, depending on the weather. Spring, once every 2 weeks or less. Following summer, once a month or not at all. So what I'm trying to show is this trend where we customize how we start the watering based on the general climate and weather, but that the general trend is always to start pushing the duration or the frequency to be less and less frequent over time, but still accommodating for those kind of fluctuations in the seasons. And so that's what you want your establishment watering to be. You want to be training the plants to go less and less, or to go on less and less water over time. But every time you water, you're going to water really, really deeply. We're talking about 1.5 to 2 inches of water if we're thinking about precipitation rate and rainfall, or if you're just hand watering, like at least 5 gallons of water for a 1 gallon plant. When you first water, your very first watering, you can't overwater. That very first watering, you put your plant in on that first day. If you gave it 30 gallons of water, that wouldn't be too much. If you did that all the time, that would probably be too much. But the very first time, it's really important to get a really good soaking, and every watering after that should be really, really thorough. So that's how you're training them, that deep water, and then followed by a dry period. You have to let that top few inches of the soil dry out before you do another deep watering. Dry out, deep watering. The longer the plant's been in the ground, the longer you can let it dry out, the farther you can let it dry, because its roots are getting deeper and deeper and deeper. So in the beginning, what you let dry out was maybe 2 inches, but after 6 months, you can let 5 inches dry out. So you're training the plants for kind of that drought tolerant strategy. I'm going to check the chat before we move on, because this was kind of a heavier chart. All right. So somebody asked. Yes, so somebody said, even with a good irrigation schedule, the chance of plant survival is much lower in a summer planting. Is that correct? Generally speaking, yes. Generally speaking, a summer planting is the most challenging for a plant, but even more challenging for the gardener. And I will say that it's largely gardener error and the shorter room for error, smaller room for error that there is for the gardener that makes the plant die. So it's generally advisable to plant at a time where you're going to have higher levels of success and the transplant shock and process is not going to be as intense. So winter is generally, unless you have snow, winter is my preferred planting time. Spring is still fine. Fall, I find, is often you get, if you don't get early rains, fall is too hot and dry still. So I'm not, fall is like, yes, early December, I think is still technically fall. So if we got some rain in October and November, and now you're going to plant in early December, then that's fine. But if you're thinking September 22nd, I'm going to start planting, that's probably the worst time you can plant. It's just way too hot. The soil has been dry for the whole several months prior. And you usually have that, 100-degree kind of end of summer, late summer, fall weather. So you generally you want to avoid summer planting generally, just because if you do get those 100-degree times and you go out of town, you don't have that window where you can like, oh yeah, it rained because it's the winter time and now I don't have to water the plants. So summer, you have to be on it and be pretty precise and exact about watching it like a hawk. So that's why they tend to be less successful. Some of the species are touchy about summer planting because they're touchy about getting too wet in hot weather. So woolly blue curls can be touchy. Some of the bush poppy, Matilha poppy sometimes touchy. Manzanitas and ceanothus can sometimes be touchy, but it's not a guarantee that they would die if you planted them in the summer. It would just depend on how well you balance that deep watering so that they don't dry out and desiccate versus letting them kind of dry out so that they don't stay hot and wet too long. So that's the balance and a little bit of a dance. So it's not impossible. If you have to do it, but if you can wait till a more favorable time of year, I would do that. So somebody said, why is the last summer schedule in the summer planting column less water than the other seasons? That was an error. I think they should say the same thing. Once a month or less, once a month or not at all. Yeah, it should, all of them should either say one or the other, but that's basically the premise is after they're established, depending on the plant that you planted, they should either be able to go on just rainfall. But if the rainfall is not at a natural level for the plant because we're in a drought year, you might find yourself supplementing irrigation even into the following summer. Oh, well, you know what, because it's summer, a second summer means the plant's already established, and generally speaking, you wouldn't be watering some of the most drought tolerant plants by the second summer, whereas the other ones are like a spring and a winter and a fall. So I think that's why. But this is for plants and not for seeds, correct? Yes. So this is for plants you're planting from pots. This is not for seeds. And generally this is plants you're planting from like a 1 gallon pot. So that's kind of your rule of thumb size that is the most common plant size. If you're planting from a 15 gallon pot, like a big tree, you're going to be planting with a lot of water, first of all. But you might find that it takes longer to dry out if you just give it a really big drenching, and you would wait maybe for like the first 5 inches to dry before or more before watering again. So you might find the frequency being farther and farther, even though you're using more water than you would for a 1 gallon. For seeds, it's totally different story. Seeds, you have to mimic the rain and the conditions that the seeds would be growing in. So for instance, if you scattered wildflower seeds, you would want to do that in the winter or right before a rain, whether it's fall or winter. And you'd want to assist if we're not getting, see, we had a really great December, but we've had like nothing since then. So say you planted it right before that wonderful storm we had in December, you would have probably watered just consistently, maybe once a week after that, just to get them to really start and get growing. In cool weather, you can do it like, if they got a really good soak, you can do it like once a week. If it's in warmer weather, you have to maybe do it every day to get something to germinate. Plant is assumed established, so less water. So once it's established, we mean that the plant's roots have gotten deep enough and ingrained enough into the surrounding soil that it can withstand natural stressors like drought and summer dormancy and all those things. So when a plant is established, it's much more in tune with its natural state and much less in tune with the unnatural nursery conditions that it's in. So remember, when you're getting these plants from the nursery, they're getting watered, if not daily, then every other day. They're getting fertilizer, they're in cushy garden soil. They have a really consistent schedule for how they're taken care of. They're planted amongst their friends. People goo and gaw over them. So it's a very different plant that you want at the end of your year than you do when you first get it at the nursery. So it's kind of like spoiled at the nursery. And so you're kind of training them to be less spoiled and to be able to survive certain kinds of natural conditions on their own and to become self-sufficient. And so that's the training that you're doing. So it's like kind of like training a kid, you know, like you're training your kid to, and I won't say they're spoiled, they're just nurtured. But after a certain point, a kid needs to be able to do things on their own. You can't necessarily breastfeed a child until they're 40. You want to make sure that they're able to kind of cope on their own. So that's what we're doing. We're making sure that the plants are able to rely on their natural strategies for survival and growth. So presumably the same interval each time, somebody asked. So I think what you mean is the same amount of water each time, potentially, and in which case, yes. So you're going to do deep watering at each time you water. Somebody asked for, what do you suggest for situations when you are installing new plants next to established plants? How do you give the new Ribes viburnifolium the summer water it needs if it's next to a well-established Arctostaphylos? So that's a very, very good question. So that's one of the challenges with irrigation, irrigating a mature garden or irrigating a new plant in a mature garden. So Arctostaphylos, for those of you who don't know it by the botanical name, is the manzanita. It's particularly touchy about being wet during summer. Its roots are susceptible to pathogens in the soil that thrive in wet, moist, hot conditions. And so they often succumb to things like root rot because of that. So if you're planting say an understory species like Ribes viburnifolium near the roots of a manzanita, what you generally will want to do is plant it during the cool time of year. 100% don't do a summer planting in that scenario. You will want to do it where the majority of its water is being done in the cool months. So do, once it cools off, you can say once it cools off in the fall, or once it cools off in the winter, you plant it at that time, give it those deep waterings, and try to wean it off slightly sooner than summer, and see how little you can go with the summer watering. See if you can just give it a shorter establishment period. If you have to water it for the summer, then you just do spot watering, meaning you only water right where that plant is and try to avoid kind of getting the any other part of the root system. So at least if something were to happen, the entire root system of the manzanita doesn't get affected, just that one little spot where you had the Ribes. So I would say just do the bare minimum with summer watering for a new plant, and 100% you plant during the cool season. Somebody else asked, would the end of February or beginning of March still be considered a spring planting? Technically it's winter, but generally the weather is much more springy. So I would say it's like an early spring planting. Somebody remarked, April showers bring May flowers. We will hope for something between now and April beyond just April, but hopefully if we don't get it, then I'd take April for sure. Is Southern California shifting to a monsoonal climate? We had summer rain last year. We have occasional summer rains. I wouldn't say it's shifting to monsoonal. Monsoons are heavy duty rains, so a light shower here and there is nothing. Most people's idea of what rain is nothing compared to what's actually penetrating in the ground. So that's another thing to note, is when it rains, don't assume that, oh, it rained and my plants are fine. Go out there, scratch the mulch. If you pull the mulch away, you'll see it's almost always just completely dry underneath, or just pull away the soil and it's barely touched the soil. It's gone maybe like 1/4 of an inch. So a lot of what we think is rain is really just washing the cars off, washing the dust off the leaves. It's all great, let's have it. But a monsoon would have been, we're talking about like torrents of rain in the summer, heavy duty rain. We haven't had that that I've seen. And if we get if it starts shifting to that place, you're going to start to see more and more issues with some of the species that are touchy about that. If it's hot and raining all the time, then we're going to start to lose a lot of plants. All right, so George also asked, California native plants must come from the California floristic province. That is true. Do we count those from the desert provinces? So that's technically California native plants. We're talking about the California floristic province. That includes most of the California coastline. It includes up into Oregon, down into Baja and the Channel Islands. However, we also include the desert species at Theodore Payne, both in the inventory for things that we sell, but also because they tend to perform really, really well in Southern California. So, so we kind of, when we say California native, most people are including the whole floristic province plus California state, like the boundary of the state, which would include the deserts as well. So it's a little bit more broad. And remember that the hard boundaries are not natural. So the plants have a lot more flexibility than we often do. We have this idea like this is native, this isn't native, and the plants don't think in those terms at all. So plant communities sometimes even blend. You might see some communities that are kind of like half desert, half not. So there's a lot of kind of unique combinations. And when something works really well and still really supports a lot of native wildlife, even if it's slightly out of the floristic province, maybe more in the deserts, but it works really well in Southern California, that's something I think that should still be planted and played with. Oh, Nick is saying there's a solid chance of rain here on Tuesday. I hope so. That would be amazing. Somebody asked, regarding mulch, are there 2 brands people can recommend? I bought something called Scott's Earth Grow at Home Depot because there are no nurseries here. And it says is construction debris free. I think I've used Earth Grow. If it looks like real legitimate bark chips, like from a living thing, like it came from a tree, it's probably fine. I wouldn't worry too much about like what's the brand so much. It's just make sure that it's not like chips of lumber, like lumber chips that's painted or dyed. All right, cool. So I think we got everything in the chat up to date. And this was kind of, again, so please use this as, like I said, a general guide to help you navigate the uniqueness of what establishment watering is and how over time you're going to want to water less and less frequently, and how that looks different depending on the planting season. So that this is meant to be kind of just, again, a basic guide, not a complete total formula. You might change it based on your soil type, based on the individual weirdness of the weather. Like, again, we're in winter, but it's 90 degrees. You're going to change the frequency based on that fact. All right. So when natives want water and why? So most native plants love rain. Actually, all native plants love rain. And they grow during the rainy season. So if you rely on water to grow, it makes more sense that you will grow during the seasons that water is brought to you. So if I need food to grow, if I don't have food, I'm not going to grow. Once people start giving me food, I'm going to grow. So hopefully that wouldn't happen. Some people grow horizontally. But as a child, you can say a child who is malnourished isn't going to grow. Given food is going to grow to full potential of that, their individual size. And so you want to think about, you know, that the majority of the water that you give a plant and that they want, it's going to be during that rainy season. So as a general rule, it's time for an irrigation or a deep soak when the soil has begun to get dry at a depth of 3 to 4 inches. So that's the establishment watering. You give it a deep soak and then you let it dry. Then after 3 to 4 inches, you know it's time for a deep soak again. So you want to water also early in the morning or later in the evening. And keep in mind, sometimes late evening watering can trigger some kinds of foliar diseases and issues like mildews and things like that. So you don't generally want to leave the leaves wet overnight if you can avoid it. However, if you're not doing it very frequently, it's usually fine. But if you're finding that you're watering more frequently, you sometimes end up with some issues. So early morning watering tends to be a little bit better because it's still cool enough that the soil stays wet for a long time, but then the sun comes out and the leaves have a chance to dry off rather than staying soggy. You need to check guidelines for watering times. And so this, again, because our sponsors are LADWP, you have certain rules if you're in LA City about when you're allowed to water and when you're not. They can be a little bit challenging with the irrigation schedule for a establishment kind of period watering because they're not entirely compatible. So we can talk a little bit about that. But generally speaking, what you want to do when you're watering is you want to replicate the wet years of a Mediterranean climate. That's about 15 to 20 inches of rainfall. If we got 15 to 20 inches of rainfall, that would be a good wet year. And that would mostly all occur during the cool months, not in the summer. That's in the establishment phase. In the case of a maintenance where the plants are already established, you let just the rainfall do that. And if it doesn't, then you supplement. And so you want to water as deeply and infrequently as possible without causing plant stress. You want to water heavily, at least 2 feet down should be how far the water goes. And you want to allow a good dry between watering cycles. You should understand and utilize controllers if you use kind of irrigation controllers that have a timer, but please don't rely too much on the automatic timing kind of features where you're just leaving it on like once a week and you don't even think about it. Adjust it based on the seasons. Quarterly basis is a good rule of thumb. So if you think about once a quarter, that means once a season. So it should be a different schedule in the spring, summer, winter, and fall. The LADWP rebate offers the use of a soil probe. So you can get a soil probe from them as part of the rebate. And you can test to see, like it comes up, I think, with like, there's 2 ways. I think you can just stab it and it gives you a number maybe, but then there's another one where you can actually like take a core sample. Those are kind of fun if you can find those. All right, so know your watering days. So we need to share this. Again, if you are in LA City or you're serviced at all by LADWP, there are odd and even addresses. Odd and even addresses have different days of the week that they're allowed to water. However, this watering schedule came about because of lawn irrigation. So this is a little bit tricky when we're trying to establish a new native plant garden to say you can only water certain times. I mean, it's okay to say certain days of the week, but the other factor is that it also limits you to, if you're watering with sprinklers, to 1 cycle of up to 8 minutes per station per watering day, or 2 15-minute cycles per watering day for standard sprinkler or for a water conserving nozzle sprinkler system. So it kind of throws off this premise of really deep soaking. So it's a little bit of a challenge. And so it's going to be kind of your job to navigate that. One thing that you should consider is that you can water at any time of the week if you're using just a hose with a like on and off nozzle. So if you're hand watering, you have a lot more freedom than if you're using an irrigation system. The other thing is you're not supposed to water between 9 and 4. That's just to reduce the amount of evaporation. And so this is just good rule of thumb anyway. But on the off chance that you have lots of different clients and you're not able to hit every house, to water it between before 9 or after 4, it can be another bit of a hiccup for you. So just keep those restrictions kind of in mind and see how you can navigate trying to stay within the restrictions, but also knowing that you're kind of trying to establish a new garden, because the new garden is not going to save you water up front. It can be very easy to stay within these restrictions after the garden is established. So this is very, it's easy to do lighter, less frequent kind of watering where you can definitely stay on this schedule and you can stay within this kind of time limit. My instinct is to say that instead of watering 3 times a week for 8 minutes, you should be able to water once a week for 24 minutes. To me, I think if you use the same amount of water, it should be fine. But I can't tell you that for 100% certain. All right, I'm going to check the chat before we talk about delivery systems and/or send you all on a break. Let's see. Okay. So, somebody's recommending different mulch options. Gorilla hair, BD white, SoCal mulch. All right, cool. All right, so before we chat delivery systems, are there any other questions thus far about I think we covered mainly like the theory of native plants that you want to water during the winter, cooler months, deep watering for establishment, letting there be a dry down period between the watering, and that the schedule will be different based on the season that you're watering. So is there any other question before we take a break on that and start discussing actual delivery systems? Yes, so drip, I don't know if drip is exempt. I don't think it's exempt from the day of the week rule. And it didn't have a specific thing about duration. I imagine it's not exempt. However, for the rebate program, if you're doing a lawn conversion, the rebate program requires you to either cap the sprinklers, if there are sprinklers, to cap them and to do hand watering, or to install a drip system. It does not allow overhead irrigation for the rebate program. I'm a fan of overhead irrigation if it's low volume and thoughtfully done, because it mimics rain, and I think the plants respond more favorably than to drip. So that's something that would be a trade-off. I would just be able to do that, but I wouldn't be able to do it within the rebate program where I would be getting that money back for it. So you just have to kind of weigh your options. The other thing is hand watering is fantastic. Depending on the size of your garden and if it's feasible for you. Hand watering could be some of the easier, a little more time consuming, but ultimately I think it's a really easy kind of workaround. Somebody's asking a question of drip versus spray on native plants. So this is exactly what we're going to get into, starting with delivery systems. So we'll get right into that after the break. So does anyone else have another question of the content up till now before we take a few minutes? We were talking about that gorilla hair was bad. Yes, so there was a comment that gorilla hair is not recommended in the previous soil slides. I'm not entirely convinced that it's bad, but I do know that because it's so fine, it can be way more flammable. So for embers and such. So if you're in a wildland zone, it's really not recommended. We're going to take a whole 10 minutes, I think. Or no, we'll take 8. Let's come back at 7. So you guys can go get some food, go to the bathroom, do your thing. Enjoy your break, everyone. Yes, thank you. I'm also going to take a break. So I know you want to study. I know you want to do homework. Play with your cat, Emily. All right. I will be back. All right. All right, it is 7 o'clock. So once people start trickling back in, we will begin. All right, cool. Okay, so let's move on to delivery systems. So when we mean delivery systems, we're talking about ways that water ends up in the garden. So overall, usually divided by overhead versus drip irrigation, but also includes hand watering and other things as well. So feel free to, again, pop questions into the chat as we go through this. So one potential option, depending on your conditions, is the cycle, soak, or pulse irrigation. So this is sometimes a feature on an automatic kind of irrigation timer system. And otherwise, you can replicate this either by setting the timer up to do this manually, or if you yourself run a sprinkler or turn something on and off manually or do hand watering, you can kind of do this approach. So a cycle and soak approach reduces runoff and increases infiltration by kind of segmenting your total runtime into smaller intervals of water application. So for instance, doing 10 minutes on, 10 minutes off, 10 minutes on, 10 minutes off, 10 minutes on, 10 minutes off, for instance, might be better than doing a whole, 30 or 40 minutes continuously, especially if you have a slope or you have any kind of runoff issues. It's better to do it in smaller increments where you allow the water to penetrate and then do it again. Allow the water to penetrate, do it again, allow the water to penetrate. So you want to consider that as an option. It usually, again, increases infiltration and makes it so that you reduce runoff as well. So you can do that with most sprinkler kind of overhead systems, but again, you can do it with like a hose end kind of oscillating sprinkler, turn it on for 10 minutes, off for 10 minutes, on for 10 minutes, off for 10 minutes, etc. So when we're talking about overhead, so overhead irrigation is a sprinkler system. There can be rotary, stream, misting, etc. They deliver water at variable precipitation rates from 0.44 inches on the low end to well over 3 inches per hour. So when we're talking about precipitation rate, that's the rate at which most irrigation systems are talked about. And when we talk about irrigation in general, it's the same as, rainfall. When we talk about inches in rainfall, it's the same kind of measurement. The reason why we talk about precipitation rate and we don't necessarily talk about time is if a lot of water is coming out for 30 minutes or a little water is coming out for 30 minutes, it makes a big difference. Your watering is completely, even if it's all for 30 minutes, it's going to be different depending on the kind of sprinkler head you're using or the kind of delivery system you're using. And so timing is not always accurate. And so you want to think about kind of inches. So the pros in terms of overhead irrigation, they're very easy to fix. So when one of them gets messed up or busted or stops working, you can see it immediately. You notice that it's just sputtering out or it's blocked or something like that, and you can fix it pretty quickly without a real big issue. It replicates rain. Rainfall is the way native plants are adapted to receiving water. The rainfall kind of gets the whole area wet equally, and that can be a negative in the sense that weeds will now come up between plants. However, it can be a huge positive because the plant's roots are able to extend as far as they want in order to get as robust and healthy as possible. So plants that have been raised on overhead irrigation and rainfall tend to have a healthier and more robust and more dispersed kind of broader root system than plants that are raised on drip irrigation or a more localized kind of irrigation system. So the distribution uniformity is simple to achieve. So for instance, you don't have one area that gets super soggy and one area that ends up dry and another area that gets soggy and another area that's dry. So generally speaking, the whole area gets wet equally. And so that's a really positive thing. And they can be put up on pop-ups, so they can end up, as high as you need. Sometimes if they don't have really good risers and they're not put on pop-ups, they can end up too low. And so you end up shooting into a plant and then you miss the plants in the back. So you can put them up on number one on risers, and then they can have pop-ups beyond that. So you can get it to really be raining on them the way that it would in nature. The downsides to sprinkler system, they don't qualify for turf replacement rebate money. So that program won't allow you to keep a sprinkler system or install one, even if the sprinkler heads are low volume sprinkler heads like MP rotators by Hunter Industries or one of those very kind of water efficient type of sprays. They can be inefficient, tend to lead to more runoff and evaporation than drip irrigation, just because they have generally more water coming out at once. But with a good design and with maybe that strategy of the pulse irrigation, you could avoid that. And there's the potential for foliar disease issues, meaning that the leaves are staying wet too often, or one of the plants is sick and they get transferred to others via wet leaves. That can be a bigger risk with an overhead system than something that isn't overhead. So to talk about drip, so there's different kinds of drip irrigation. There's point source or grid pattern or inline drip systems. They deliver water at a low precipitation rate, lower than a sprinkler system, generally speaking, anywhere from 0.16 inches to 1.6 inches of rain, depending on the system you're using. Not all drip is created equal, so please know your equipment. Some of the pros, they're efficient underneath mulch, especially because it kind of keeps the water from evaporating. So water efficiency is good. They do qualify for a turf replacement rebate, and you can run much larger zones. So when you're designing your irrigation system and the zones in a landscape, because so little water is coming out at once, you end up being able to irrigate much larger zones with a drip hose than you would with a sprinkler system. The downside to that is that because you're able to do that, the distribution uniformity is pretty poor for a drip system. So it's very challenging to get the same amount of water applied across the whole zone equally, because you have these, even with an inline or grid kind of system, where you have an emitter every 1 foot, and each, say the grid is spaced every 1 foot, you still have a hypersaturation at the dripper and potentially significantly less saturation in some scenarios, dry spots where there are not drippers. And so hypersaturated and sometimes waterlogged soils can occur from drip irrigation, as well as just that unequal kind of pattern. So there was somebody who said that they attempted to do a yarrow lawn. Instead of a regular lawn, they used yarrow, and they wanted just yarrow everywhere. And they used this inline kind of drip irrigation, and the yarrow was big and beautiful right over each dripper, and bald and naked and awful everywhere else. So it really does favor the certain plants really do kind of gravitate to where the main water is, and you find poorer conditions everywhere else. Breakdowns are really hard to detect. So for instance, because it's happening all underground and sometimes under your mulch, you can't tell that there's something wrong. You can't tell if an emitter is clogged. And so you will end up only being able to tell when your plant is dead. So that's the unfortunate thing. When a sprinkler that's above ground and very visible breaks down, you can see it immediately. When a dripper gets clogged, you only find out when the plant is dead, unless you're going out there every week and checking them. And you have to use manual irrigation to mist the foliage. So one of the wonderful things about being able to irrigate above ground is that ability to clean off and dust off the leaves of the plants. Depending on where you are, if you're anywhere where, you know, you have horse trails, or it's out a little bit more in nature, or a construction site, or anything like that, like you'll see the dirt and the debris stick to the, you know, plants nearby. And so you would have to use an actual hose to hose that off, rather than use your sprinkler system, which automatically does it. It also, plants can take a very small amount of moisture from their leaves as well. So the plants, especially who are maybe coastal sage scrub species that are used to absorbing a little bit of moisture through their leaves via fog, they do like to have some moisture on their leaves. So I'm going to check the chat before we move on. Don't put machine near electrical poles or socket lines. Okay. Might be, yes. So one of the things about sprinkler heads is sometimes they get blocked by shrubs as the plants fill in. And so you want to be careful about that. A dripping bucket. I'm assuming that's referring to a bucket with a hole in it, like a 5-gallon bucket, like next to a plant. So you can use that. I would put on both sides, however, not just in one. Is the 1-gallon watering rule same for succulents or cactus when plants are being established? So 5 gallons would be, for a 1-gallon plant, 5 gallons of water is what you want. Succulents and cactus do not want that much water, generally speaking. So sometimes for cactus, you can literally just like lay them on the soil and not even worry too much. I would water them much less frequently. I would do, I don't know, certain succulents can do a little bit more, but 2 weeks, once a month kind of irrigation. Have you seen Oyas irrigation? I think it's called Oyas. Does it work for natives? So yes, that is the clay pot irrigation. So you take a narrow mouth clay with a big belly clay pot, you bury it in the soil, you fill it with water, and then you plant things around it. And the premise is that clay pot just oozes water little by little, and it's more efficient than drip irrigation. It's very, very successful in vegetable gardening. I would not say that it's quite as successful with native plant irrigation. And the reason for that is that most of the time native plants are not getting water from seeping underground water sources. They're getting it from above ground that actually gets to percolate all the way through. And so I would say that the plants that can grow in similar conditions to vegetables, and or maybe a riparian plant even potentially might like that. But I wouldn't, again, it's a localized water source. So if you have like a planter and you're planting cilantro in 4 corners and you got this big clay pot in the middle, it's super great. But in a real world kind of landscape, I probably wouldn't rely on that. Let's see. Sorry, I'm having a hard time with that. Okay. How do you know at 0.16 an hour on the drip system, how much does the plant need? So you're going to want to generally give 5 gallons per plant. And a lot of the, we'll show you a kind of like a spec sheet for one of the drip systems. They often do gallon per hour as their measure, and then you can convert it to precipitation rate. Does a bush need a certain number, for instance, how many inches of water per plant? So generally speaking, your plants want to be when you do a deep watering, 1.5 inches, 1.5 inches to 2 inches of water. So really deep, deep soak. So about 5 gallons or more for a 1-gallon plant. If you're doing it like by watering can or you know, some other hand watering. And then for the other information for drip irrigation, that's really very, very important, is the maintenance needs on drip irrigation are generally pretty high. One of the things that people end up doing is they install a drip system and then they don't move the emitters ever for the life of the plant. So they sometimes will plant, you know, put say point source emitters, so they'll put an emitter here and an emitter here. And then the plant gets way bigger and the emitters are still right there. And so now all the thing is doing is just making the crown of the plant, the root crown where the stem is meeting the soil, super water saturated. And that is a prime condition for root rot or crown rot, forgive me. So in that scenario, for a mature plant to be getting all that moisture just around the crown, eventually that plant will decline and you'll pick it up and it'll come right out like it has no roots attached to it. It just rotted right there. And so one of the things that's most often neglected with drip irrigation systems is that you have to change the orientation of everything as the plants mature. So if you had an emitter here and an emitter here, as the plant gets bigger, you have to move those out farther and you have to add 2 more on either side. So then you have 4 emitters as the plant gets bigger. And if the plant gets even bigger, then you have to add 4 more on top of that and make them spaced out even farther. You want to water at the drip line of the plants, not at the crown. But when they're little baby plants, you are going to be watering them closer, but you have to move them out every 4 months, 4 to 6 months. You have to think about moving all those emitters, and that can be really a hassle. So just whereas sprinkler systems, you never got to move them, it waters everything. It tends to be much more efficient and easier and less kind of high maintenance over time. All right. So understand your wetting patterns based on the soils, able to convert or have handy manufacturer's application rate charts. So that's the thing we'll show you. Point source emitters deliver water at one focal point in the landscape. So you have to add emitters as the garden matures. So that's exactly what I just shared with you. And avoid placing the emitter too close to the crown of the plant. So this is an application rate chart. So for instance, this emitter flow rate, so this particular brand, this particular emitter gives you 0.6 gallons per hour from one emitter. So if you use this chart, say the row spacing, let's say it's 24. So these are those like inline rows. So if you're going to space them every 2 feet, let's see, and then the emitter spacings are say also at every 2 feet, and you want to find out the precipitation rate. The precipitation rate for a 0.6 gallon per hour drip inline system would be the gallons per hour times this constant, 1.605, over the area. So the area is 24 by 24. So 2 feet by 2 feet, we're talking about 4 square feet. In a 4 square feet zone, you multiply 0.6 gallons per hour by this constant over 4, and you end up with this number, 0.24. So in that space, with this spacing, with a 24-inch emitter spacing and a 24-inch row spacing, you can count on 0.24 inches per hour. So if you want to get to 1.5 inches per hour, you have to do it for a lot of hours, because this is 0.24 for an hour. So whatever, I don't even know math anymore. That's almost like 0.25. So you would need 4 of those to get to 1 inch. So you need 4 hours just to get 1 inch of water. That's a lot. So it just shows you how long you have to irrigate. But if you do it maybe 24 inches by 12 row spacing, then you can do it in less time than that. Or if you do a 12 by 12, then you get almost an inch in an hour. So you could do it like an hour and a half, and you will get the 1.5 inches of precipitation. So this is how you kind of read these things. So you can use this formula to get those numbers, but it also just gives you a good impression that most drip systems need to be left on for a long time. So I just did a job recently where the guy said, I water every day for 15 minutes. 15 minutes is like teaspoons of water. You really do need to leave it for hours to get a really nice deep soak, depending on, obviously the flow rate. So somebody says, would you not just not use emitters, just pre-drilled drip lines? So it's the same deal. The pre-drilled drip lines give you something slightly more regular, but they're really hard to move once they're in. So if they're right next to the plant's getting really big and the emitters are right there, it's a problem. The or the holes, are right there. If you use that point source emitters with the little like spaghetti tube or something, you can customize how long that goes, and you can, start it here and then extend it out to here and extend it out to there, and then add them. And it's a little more flexible, I think. But again, it's still something that's going to require more attention from you than a sprinkler system, and it's delivering water in a way that's less natural to a plant. So remember, the plant is normally always receiving water in this really distributed, even manner from the sky. And so replicating that and mimicking what a plant already, experiences in nature is usually a better bet. So we already showed you this diagram with regards to soil. So just another update or another refresher that sandy soil. So imagine there was like a drip hole or emitter right here, and it was dripping. It would go down much faster in sandy soil than clay soil. And not only would it go down faster, it would have less of that spread because it's gravity that's pulling it down, rather than capillary action in more clay soil. So you'll see a bigger wet mark in clay soil than you will see in sandy soil. Oh yes, so George is saying to hide. That's another con that I wasn't on the list, and I should say it. I thank you for reminding me. Hide emitters well. I've seen a rabbit chew through the spaghetti line. So yes, animals will chew through any drip line to access water. If you are putting drippers in an area that has high wildlife, you will often get rabbits, rats, and coyotes chewing through the lines. So at Theodore Payne, they designed a whole section of their demonstration garden to demonstrate drip irrigation, and other sections to demonstrate a sprinkler system. And they ended up having to convert the whole area that they were doing drip irrigation to sprinkler system because animals chewed through it repeatedly over and over, and they were just, gushing water all the time. So yes, coyotes will eat it to get the water. Rats will eat it. I think rats actually just like like the plastic, I don't know. And rabbits will chew through it. Ground squirrels will chew through it. So just be aware of the kind of wildlife you have. If you're in the middle of the city, probably not a big deal, but if you're in that wildland interface zone, then you're gonna have an issue. Maggie says that at her garden, she leaves out small trays or bowls of water near some of the hose bibs, so animals drink that instead of chewing irrigation, and it works really well. So certainly you can try to divert some of their attention that way. And Jack just gave a high five. All right. So practical tips. Many native plants benefit from infrequent deeper irrigation post-establishment during the dry season, but many will not take any irrigation in the summer post-establishment. So you need to know your plants. So I mentioned the plants that are touchy about summer irrigation: woolly blue curls, bush poppies, Matilaha poppy, manzanitas, ceanothus in general. So you need to know what plants are in your garden and not think that it's a one-size-fits-all approach. At the same time, there are some plants that can take another, deep soak once a month in the summer, or every 21 days or something. You can plant mugwort or mule fat, or some other species that are a little bit more flexible. Species that take can take seasonal flooding, can often take that kind of like summer moisture. Some species from the desert are used to summer moisture, or they come from desert washes where they get summer flooding during the rainy season, like the desert willow. So desert willow would love a deep watering once a month in the summer, hot as can be. It would love a hot summer irrigation. But if you planted a desert willow next to a manzanita and water them the same, you'd kill the manzanita. And so just know your plants, know where they come from in nature, and so that you can customize how you design the garden so that they're matching, have very similar kind of irrigation needs, and you're either not watering certain ones in the summer or watering other ones in the summer because they're more flexible. So you want to customize it. On new plantings and young gardens, you may need to water lightly in between. And in addition to the deep soak irrigations, especially if you're planting plants in a mature garden, find the balance. So again, we talked about that. It's you might have to do a little bit more frequent for a new baby plant and less frequent for a mature plant, and finding the balance between those is sometimes a little bit tricky. So on any garden, the light refreshing sprinkles will freshen the plants, wash the leaves, and keep the soil surface a little cooler and somewhat moist. So that tends to be my kind of maintenance irrigation. So after the plants are established, after their first year, we can say that these plants can survive on natural normal levels of rainfall. When we get below normal levels of rainfall, what I do is I mimic an ideal rainy season with supplemental irrigation during the rainy season. So I wouldn't have watered in December, but I probably would have watered and given a nice deep watering in January. And if we don't get irrigation or we don't get rain in February, I'll give another once a month, kind of thing through February, through March, maybe through April. But then once we reach summer, all I will probably do is this light refreshing sprinkle that is referenced at the bottom here. So unless it's again, species that can take that, like a desert willow or something that can take a nice deep soak in the summer, I prefer doing lighter touches throughout the summer to keep things a little bit fresh, rather than, and by fresh, I just mean like not completely shut down dormant. They don't always look super perky, but it does help. So winter months should bring about 15 inches between November and March. So if we're not getting that level, you need to raise it up. So that's what I mentioned. I would water in January, I'll water again in February, I'll water again in March until we're reaching what should be normal levels. So sometimes you'll have a scenario where we won't get anything and then we'll get like some monsoony, like crazy thing in April. And that's okay. If we go a little higher than 15 inches, that's fine. But 15 inches is a good, I think, rule of thumb for most of Southern California. In between April and October, you don't want to do a ton, but again, it depends on the kinds of plants you have. So that's a huge range, somewhere between 0 inches to 1.5 inches per rain event. It really depends on what you have in your garden. And then 1 gallon per square foot. That's kind of roughly, if that helps you mentally think about it. 1.5 inches of rain delivers per square foot about 1 gallon of water. So this is what I mentioned about what's the natural flow of the rain in Southern California for the most part. This is Los Angeles County. You can see we got the most rain in January, February, March, kind of a little bit November, December, and the least amount of rain starting like May, June, definitely July, August, September. And so if you do what most people do, when I talked about in the beginning, irrigating native plants is about unlearning more things than learning, and it's about deprogramming more than it is about programming. We have to deprogram the tendency and the instinct of people to try to make up for this big hole here by watering less here and filling this up with water. That's what people do. It's hot, it's dry. The plants must want water during this time. And it's actually the opposite. Our drought-tolerant native plants want water during the time that it's natural for them to have water, meaning the cooler months of the year. They want water the least when it's the hottest. Why? Because this is how they have been for millennia. They are not adapted to receiving this level of water at this time of year. The only exceptions are, again, riparian species that are meant to be irrigated year-round. Some species that take summer, seasonal flooding. Some of our desert species that are tolerant of, not only tolerant of, but maybe thrive under monsoonal summer rain conditions. So there are, that's what it said, know your plants, do a little research about your plants. But on the whole, if you're planting coastal sage scrub, chaparral, southern oak woodland, kind of local Southern California plant communities, many of those prefer the least amount of water during these months. So again, light refreshing sprinkles are one thing, deep soaking, saturating irrigation is quite a different thing. You will still do deep saturating soaks during the establishment year. First year, you have to do this all year long with less and less frequent as you go on. But every year after that, you want to kind of mimic what's natural and fill in the gaps. If we don't get enough rain here, or don't get enough rain here, don't get enough rain here, increase those numbers artificially, but don't excessively water during this time. This is the time when they are needing to shut down. This is the time where if you give too much water, many of their roots will rot, or they'll just hate you. They'll just hold resentment in their hearts for you, unless they're a species that likes it. So yes, this is just repeating more of what I said. If you have a dry winter, add more irrigation to equal the average total for your area. Get ahead of wind and extreme heat events during the summer. So some people, if it's 110 degrees, they will be like, oh, I better water my plants because it's 110 degrees. No, if you know it's going to be 110 degrees, water your plants the week before. Don't water them super duper deep, but do water them a little bit like the week before when it's still 85. That's generally a better rule of thumb. If you have a wet winter, keep the irrigation turned off. Please don't just irrigate just to irrigate. Don't leave automatic timers on and have the thing that I hate to see, which is lawns or gardens being watered while it's raining or right the day after a rain. However, if it just sprinkles or it rains like 0.01 inches, don't think that that did anything for the garden, because it probably didn't. And do follow up with some more rain, because in that scenario, maybe that little 0.01 inches kind of prepped the ground and made it a little bit more receptive. And then when you follow up with some water, it actually absorbs it a little bit more readily. So only turn off the sprinkler system, turn off your irrigation, and don't have any plan for irrigating if it's a nice big rainfall. We're talking about an inch, an inch and a half, 2 inches, 3 inches, etc. So I'm going to check the chat before moving on. All right, I'm seeing thumbs up. Not 15 inches a month, 15 inches for the year. Ideally during the rainy season of the year, between November and March, correct. Thank you, Kyle, for that answer. It never rains in Southern California. I wish it did more. And then there's a link to rain on some years, documents historical. There was apparently a year, I don't know if it was in the 1800s, there was 0 rainfall for the whole year. Imagine going through the whole winter with 0. It's possible. And then just other practical tips. If the soil is sandy, you're going to be watering more. If it's really clay, you're going to be watering less. If it's in the shade, you'll be watering less. If it's in the sun, you'll be watering more. So just, always keep those little conditions in mind. And that context we were talking about, the abiotic and biotic factors, keep those in mind when you're designing an irrigation system. But for the first year, so right, we're talking about establishment irrigation. For the first year, you're going to do more than 15 inches of rain. So when we were talking about 15 inches from November to March, that's just to do the maintenance watering, right? So make sure that there's 15 inches, whether it's coming from rain or 15 inches happens during November and March. But for the first year, when you're doing establishment watering, when I said deep water, every time is deep watering, and you're going to do less and less frequent over time. You want to aim for like 30 to 50 inches of rain between actual rainfall and irrigation water. So you're not going to be saving water yet. And hand watering might be necessary in the first several months. in that case, in the case that, you know, hand watering is going to be necessary, you might, you know, consider charging extra for the extra attention you're going to be giving to the new plants when they're first, you know, planted. So this gives you kind of this is from 2020 and 2021, so this isn't super duper current, but you can see a trend that's happening. And the trend is the rainfall that's measured compared to what the normal, seemingly normal average rainfall is, monthly normal, and then the departure for the month. So you can see that each month is less than what is considered our normal amount. This is actually from Pasadena, but you can see that we're getting drier, you know, and so you will have to accommodate in each of these months to try to get it up to that amount of additional rainfall. So when I said that in the winter, for instance, if you were doing December and they measured 1.3 inches and it should be around 3.3 inches, you're going to find yourself giving it an extra 2 inches that month, roughly, to kind of increase the rainfall artificially. So just basic, where do we water? So we talked about the theory of watering, the delivery systems of watering. So where do we water? We want them to be watered at the drip line. You want it to be watered all around the plant, ideally, not just in one spot, all around the plant. While the plant is really small, 2 emitters on either side usually can do the trick, but has to increase the influence of the water as the plant gets bigger. If you're doing hand watering, nice big circle on the plant and around the plant. If you're doing sprinkler system, everything gets wet, so we're covered. But generally speaking, the drip line is this space where the leaves kind of stop. That's where the roots want to go. When you first plant the plant, you do have to water the root ball itself, but then you want to really emphasize this area right out here. Slopes are very challenging because obviously the water runs off the slope. So you might consider actually terracing a slope if you have the either ability, capability, the money, the labor to do that. Or you could do individual basins for the plants. So you can plant the plant and kind of build a little bit of a basin so that the water kind of catches in that area. So that's an option. I've seen people use cutouts of pots that they use in the soil, and they kind of create their own like plastic barrier basin. So the water can kind of catch into there. And then you can also do, conceivably drip irrigation can be more effective on a slope because it actually like drips into the soil rather than the sprinklers, which would potentially have a higher runoff ability. All right. And make sure you're getting adequate water throughout the slope with check valves because the water pressure going uphill, you don't want the water backflowing. I think that's more of a technical thing. Oh, is that it? All right. Okay, so your homework for this next round is to evaluate a client's irrigation system. If you do not have a client, this can be your own home irrigation system or an irrigation system at the apartment building you live in, or an irrigation system at, I don't know, just some other place. Maybe a botanical garden would let you explore their irrigation system or give you some information about it. So what delivery system is it using? The make and the model. Is it Hunter Industries, MP rotator heads, and I don't know what exactly model it would be, but is it that? Is it such and such drip system? Is it a hose and a nozzle and it's literally just hand watered? So evaluate that irrigation system. If it has the make and the model and it's something a little bit more complex than using just a hose in your hands, use the manufacturer's spec sheet and find out the precipitation rate and calculate how long to run the system to irrigate 1.5 inches. So if it says its precipitation rate is this sprinkler system will irrigate 2 inches per hour, and we want to wet 1 inch, that's the example that's given here. You're going to do 1.5 inches, but say you wanted to wet only 1 inch, and it's at 2 inches per hour. How long do you run it? You run it for half an hour to get 1 inch. So if you wanted 1.5 inches, which is what this question is asking, you would water it for 45 minutes, I believe, if I did my math right in my head. So, and also, what would your irrigation plan look like for the first year? So first year, that's establishment watering phase. Well, how would you plan an irrigation plan for first year? So usually like 1.5 inches each watering cycle, generally speaking. So a deep watering each time with kind of like a model where you're eventually tapering off the frequency, and you can refer back to that chart based on the, you know, the seasons, but also keep in mind an individual site. So if you're doing this client's irrigation system and you say like, I know that this is under the shade of an oak tree all the time, there's a little bit of clay soil, it stays relatively cool and moist, so this the chart that, you know, Catherine wrote up, it seems a little too frequent. Actually, I think the soil stays, you know, moist longer than what it's recommending here, so I would change it this way, you know. So think about what an irrigation plan would look like for a first year. Using the manufacturer's spec sheet, find the precipitation rate, it'll just list it usually, and then calculate how long to run the system to irrigate 1.5 inches. And then when you do your irrigation plan, you're going to say, hey, if it says 40, you determine it's 45 minutes, 45 minutes once a week for the first 2 months, then it's going to be, you know, 45 minutes every 10 days, and it's going to be 45 minutes every 2 weeks, and it's going to be 45 minutes every 3 weeks, and it's going to be 45 minutes once a month for the next 3 months, and then that's your first year. You know, so that's kind of what we're talking about. It's a schedule. So think about that. And if it's something where, hey, you know what, I don't have access to an actual irrigation system, and this is just something that I do by hand with a watering can, and it's a very small, you know, small space, then use the 1 gallon plant. So 1 gallon pot, 5 gallons of water general rule. So for each 1 gallon pot, you would water 5 gallons of water at each time you water. So that would be like on the plant and in a circle around the plant. So that's something you can consider as well. So I'm going to check the chat. Somebody asked, would you consider the irrigation technique for native shrubs such as milkweed, native sages, and California buckwheats similar to the technique for lavenders and rosemary? By technique, I don't know about technique as much as compatibility. All of those natives tend to be tougher than lavenders and rosemary. However, they're generally considered compatible because they're all in the Mediterranean, California friendly Mediterranean plant grouping. Lavenders I don't think are as tough as rosemary in my experience. I have seen rosemary go without water much more successfully than lavenders. But generally speaking, they're kind of, they can be compatible. They could generally be put in the same kind of hydro zone, but I would find the native plants are going to be better at toughing out low summer water and high heat conditions ultimately. Somebody asked, my house still has the irrigation from when it was an avocado orchard. Sure, definitely do that. That's awesome. In my training, I learned we should not group a moderate medium water need plant with a very low one in hydro zone. Absolutely. Does that rule apply for native irrigation? Absolutely. You still want to match plants to the same hydro zone that they would require. So if you have, regardless whether native, non-native, you want to match water needs in the garden. So low water need plants next to low water need plants, native or not. high water need plants next to high water need plants, native or not. So don't think native plants somehow all should be on the same irrigation system. If you have a riparian native next to a super drought tolerant native and you put them next to each other and you irrigate them the same, one of them's going to die, depending on what you do. If you water too much to keep the riparian one alive, the drought tolerant one will rot. If you water that one little to keep it alive, the one that requires more water will dry up and die. So you still have to design your spaces based on hydrozone, regardless of what kind of plants you're using. If we are looking at drip irrigation, how can we find out the precipitation rate? The spec sheet, if it has that kind of those application rates, you can do that little formula. I'll go back to it if you want. Otherwise, sometimes it just lists it. But if it just lists the gallons per hour, then you need to use this formula to calculate the precipitation rate. So feel free to write that down. But generally speaking, I think that it's going to be listed somewhere for you. Somebody else asked, if you have low water need natives like ceanothus and non-natives like rosemary together, how would you handle the summer? I hope that rosemary survives without water. I have found rosemary to survive without summer water. I have had a parkway garden that has no irrigation system that has never received summer water for the last 10 years. And rosemary, creeping rosemary is on there, as well as manzanita and other native plants. And so they has never received summer water, and the rosemary is fine. So I think, I don't think I'm not 100%, but I really don't think lavender can make that cut. But so far, rosemary seems pretty darn resilient. So I can't say that my parkway garden is 100%. It's always going to be that way, and anyone else's garden in any conditions. But it's definitely been one of the ones that's not seemed particularly affected by no summer irrigation. All right. So any other questions? I'll go back to the homework. There you go. Do these things and do it to the best of your ability based on the resources that you have and the scenarios and situations and conditions and spaces that you have to play with. And go ahead and you can email them to me if you do it before tomorrow, which is almost impossible because it's nighttime right now. You can just tell me tomorrow rather than email it. But otherwise, do the wildergardens@gmail.com. Just send it to me. I'll put that in the chat again for those of you who don't have my email yet for some reason. And then somebody also asked, how about wildflowers? How do you irrigate after sowing seeds? You irrigate to mimic the natural rainy season, which is when wildflowers would germinate. So you sow the seeds in the winter, you water it really deeply if it's not with a natural rain, and you make sure the soil stays moist consistently until you start to see sprouts. The bigger the sprouts get, the more you can leave little dry gaps between your watering until you just stop watering after spring, because they're going to just be blooming their heads off and then seeding and then dying in that summer anyway. So it's very frequent, like daily irrigation. Then you start spacing it out for the next few months till you're doing every week to every 2 weeks, and then you stop. Evan, yes, you can stick around after class. So let's see, what time is it? So we're about 10 minutes early. But if anybody has any questions, you're welcome to stick around and ask them. Otherwise, thank you all so much for coming. If you haven't signed up for the workshop and you want to come in person to Tree People's headquarters to do a little bit follow-up, please make sure you go to Brenda's email where you got the link to this class. There are 2 links to sign up to the workshops, and you can go in person and see me and talk about stuff. We're going to take a tour of the grounds at Tree People. We're going to discuss irrigation and how it relates to some of the kind of environment. So like the abiotic and biotic factors that we talked about, how and then also how do you kind of design an irrigation system to maximize roof runoff, and how do we, plant plants for those kinds of different scenarios. So it'll be a nice kind of walk and talk, and pretty, relaxed day where you can, talk and ask all sorts of questions and have an actual environment that can trigger some of those questions. All right, thank you, everybody. Is a group of, yes, and Ryan and everybody who's part of those landscape teams, 100%. If you just if you're doing a team, if you're like a team exercise, like you guys did with the soil, and you just want one spokesperson to kind of send all your work in, 100%, you don't have to each send me your homework. So if you've all done it together and you're all part of a team, like send me a photo of you guys working together, because that's awesome to see. But I agree that it's, yeah, CC everybody into the email. So it's like, hey, this is our assignment, rather than sending a bunch of individual emails. It's easier on my inbox, but also I think easier on you guys. Thank you, thank you.
Hey, Catherine.
Yes, you had the question.
Yeah, I have a few of them.
Okay.
So basically the project I'm working on now is, funny enough, is really highly compacted soil, but also drains really, really fast.
Okay.
So we got a soil test done by Waypoint Analytics, and they said that after some decompacting, we should put a layer, like a 1-inch layer of compost down. And they said, and I asked them specifically to test for California natives for this project. So I've just gotten a little confused because we called Theodore Payne today and they said one thing, and then we have the test, and then we also have the classes that we've been taking through the LADWP.
Right.
And so what our plan was to decompact with an auger drill bit, and then lay the compost down. But then when we were talking to Theodore Payne folks today, they were like, don't do, they said, don't do compost. But the thing is that there has not been grass for a really long time. So the soil's just been open to like the dogs running on it. It's south facing. It's just like super intense sun.
Yeah.
Totally baked out. So should I continue with the plan that the soil analysis told us?
Sometimes you'll find native plants will do fine even in a really degraded soil. However, I would be a little more, if you're planning on a native plant community after this, I would also, I mean, conceivably the compost is probably fine. I don't think it's going to hurt it. But I do think that you should look into getting a mycorrhizae inoculant. So it's a fungal inoculant, and you might be interested in arbuscular mycorrhizae inoculant, which is a slightly more generalized type, and you might consider adding that to the soil. Whether that's fine to do in conjunction, I think it's fine to do in conjunction with compost, most likely. But ultimately it needs the plants that it's a host of, or that are the hosts of that particular fungal spore to activate. And so you'll need to, plant shortly after that, I think.
Okay.
But you might consider that. I can see if I can find the company.
And what would we be doing that for, just to prevent?
It will create a soil culture underground that supports native plants. So what mycorrhizae does is it's a fungus that attaches kind of to the roots of native plants. Actually, I think it's like 80 to 90% of plants on the planet are kind of compatible, but with particular strains. But it attaches to the roots of the plants. It takes sugars from the plants, and it gives back water and other nutrients, and also like forms other networks. So part of the kind of health and requirement for native kind of ecosystems underground. And so one of the things that happens when we're working in super degraded sites is that it doesn't have kind of that intact soil culture underground. And so most people think just add compost, and that's not necessarily bringing that component into it. Sometimes it's only present really still in more unaltered natural lands.
Okay.
So you might, let me see if I can just find a link for you of the.
Yeah, or if you can, I know how to spell fungal and inoculant, but the other words I was not.
Mycorrhizae. It's
totally
a
sure.
weird. Hold on. MYCORRIZAE. But I'm gonna find the actual company that you can buy some from, and I think it like will come like granular.
Okay.
Where is that? Sorry, I'm taking forever.
No problem.
Oh, there's all sorts of, this is not the one. Gosh, what was it called? Well, you know what I'll just do is I'll just refer you to another specialist.
Great, thank you.
This is a great person. This is a specialist who I am going to be meeting and working on a project with, but he's like super knowledgeable. So I'm going to put his website in the chat. I think he's based out of Oregon. Oops. I accidentally did not send that to everyone. There we go. Micro Roots.
Okay. Super cool. I've never heard of any of that. So that's
it's
really
more native plant specific and a little bit less like compost is, I'm not like super anti-compost. I think sometimes people with native plants can be a little too anti-compost. But I do think that it's not doing the whole thing that's really needed for the native plants. And I think it sometimes adds way too much organic matter and way too much fertility. And it gives a really good first impression of like, oh yeah, the plants are super happy, but it's usually a very superficial first year, like they're really growing and then they either collapse or it just slows down drastically after that, after they've sucked up all of that fertility. The one thing that I would say might be helpful is that you get some of that microbiotic activity in compost as well. I don't think it's the right, strains for native plants necessarily, but it can still like activate soils that are really, really just baked and doing nothing. So I think if you had to do one, if you couldn't do like the mycorrhizal fungal inoculant stuff, and the other option was to just leave it as is, it might be worth it to still put a layer of compost on top just to get some kind of insects in there, even if that's all.
Yeah, there's none of those.
Yeah, so I mean, conceivably it can still be kind of beneficial, but it's not needed. And like I said, it usually gives an artificial sense of success and not a long-term kind of success.
Okay, great. My
Yeah.
other questions are specific and can wait. So I think there are some other folks who might have some. So thank you so much.
Anybody else have other questions? Oh, we have, let's see, questions in the chat. Too much organic matter via compost can be harmful. Yeah. Yeah, it promotes some of those same scenarios of like that kind of like root rotting situation for native plants that are used to really like leaner conditions. What about planting deep-rooted grasses there to remediate the compacted soil? Yeah, generally bunch grasses are really fantastic at that. If you remember, one of the slides was, like don't till. Maybe like drilling holes is one thing, I think, versus like fluffing, like artificially trying to fluff the soil. But roots do the best job, and mulching on top does a good job. So mulch would be probably a better, slower, you get a slower appearance of success, but ultimately would be a little bit more natural if you just did heavy mulch and just over time allowed it to degrade, and it alters the soil pretty quickly. After like a year, you can already notice. Somebody said gardeners of Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center found the same thing and talked about it on a podcast. Are we talking about, what are we talking about? Oh, also a compacted soil, also gonna mulch. Yeah, I mean, maybe just keep the compost real thin. Don't make it too much if you're gonna do it. But if you're also gonna mulch, you might find for a native system, that's all it really needs. If it drains well, then maybe just mulch and inoculating the soil. Jack, hopefully there's time for a nursery visit. Yes, we should do that. That would be a lot of shoes to spray. We'll wait till the hardcore people who are still left. We'll have like 5 people go at the end.
That would be totally cool, because I'm sure some people would be interested, but if for people who are not getting into this side of it at all, then have a nice weekend.
Yeah.
But yeah, we have we're really good at germinating certain things, but other things we're like, why can't you get bigger? And would love to have your perspective on that.
Oh, I'd love to go there. Yeah, we'll stop at the nursery.
I can also give you some pots, and I think we could give you some. Someone just dropped off like 3,000 acorns yesterday too, so I'd be happy. Yeah, they'd happy to give some acorns and stuff to you also.
Oh my God!
And to other people who want them.
Who has acorns now? Where are the acorns still?
I was honestly surprised that they were turned in as good a shape as they are, and they're agrifolia, and they're not. Most of them aren't even sprouting. He didn't even keep them wet, so I don't know. Lucky me, but
yeah.
Like the silver lining of the pandemic is that there's no staff here, so we're just like taking over all the refrigerators at work with bags of soil and acorns, but I can't really take on another 2,000-3,000 acorns. So yeah.
That's too funny. Yeah, I'll take some off your hands.
Right
I don't know, I can't take 3,000, but I can take some.
Yeah. Cool, 500, you got it.
All right. All right, that's awesome. Yes, we'll visit. And then let me know, is there anything that I should be bringing other than myself tomorrow? You guys have everything set up, don't you?
I think so.
We're not really
set up
doing it.
is like a little bit of it'll be interesting. I'll be there to support you.
Good. Okay.
And find things, but we're finding out that a lot of the irrigation that was installed 10 years ago has been layered and layered upon with mulch.
Yeah.
So there's a little bit of a scavenger hunt going on there,
right.
But we'll figure it out. It's all good.
I like the demo of the rain garden and the rain barrels and all that stuff is, I think, a little bit more awesome to me. So I might just like focus on that and just answer questions. And yeah, my technical skills with regards to, setting up irrigation or any of that is pretty limited. So if people want super specifics about that, they might have to go to you, Jack. You're like, I don't know. I'm very good at the theory of irrigation. When it comes to actual, like, this component is this, like, that's when I hire somebody.
I'm really good at carrying buckets of water.
Yeah.
The irrigation part is like not my strong suit either. So
Right.
learn together.
Yeah.
All right, cool. Well, yeah, thanks for hanging out for a few more minutes. Let's see you tomorrow.
Yeah, see you tomorrow. I'll try to get there around 8, so I'll be
Okay.
there a bit early.
Right on. See you then.
Okay.
Bye.
If anybody else has any other questions, I can hang on a little longer. And Evan, go for it.
Sorry, I couldn't see or I didn't hear. Will there be any rain barrel or rain catching stuff being talked about
Yeah.
tomorrow?
There's a really cool demonstration feature at Tree People. Few things. One, their actual headquarters irrigations runs off of this enormous underground cistern that collects all the rainwater from the site, number one. Number two, there's an actual little demonstration piece where they have this like little fake house side by side, where there's one that just the runoff is very conventional, where they just send the water out into the street, and they're trying to demonstrate that kind of a residential stormwater strategy, which is not a good one. And then juxtaposed with one that has like a rain barrel and a little rain garden, and kind of just like using those as models of what's the more responsible way of managing stormwater on your property versus just like letting it rush off into the storm drains and then out into the river and then out into the ocean, etc. So they actually do have these kind of educational components that I do want to highlight. And rain barrel and rain capture is one of those.
Okay, and are they open to the public in general if we can't make it tomorrow?
Yeah,
See that
they're
stuff? Okay.
you can go there. They have hiking trails. Their grounds are open. Whether their buildings are like open to people walking inside is a different story, but they're definitely their grounds and those demonstration features that I've just mentioned are open.
Okay, thank you so much.
Yeah, you're welcome. All right, any other questions? Emily's just a diehard. I'll see you tomorrow too, Emily, or will you be there? No. You're tired
I'll
of
be
Tree
like,
People?
I'm gonna be there, but we have a first aid training, so
Oh.
I'm gonna be in the conference center right next to y'all. But we have an hour lunch break, so maybe it'll be when you're doing a nursery tour. I'll
Yeah,
like
maybe.
pop in there and be like, then run
Take
back.
some acorns.
Yeah, basically.
All
All
right,
right,
cool.
sweet.
Maybe see you tomorrow then.
Maybe
All right.
see you for a bit tomorrow.
Okay. All right. And then George, you had a question. So the summer water reduction is very species specific. How to tell by the annual rainfall of the natural setting. I generally, if it's a drought tolerant plant, I err on the side of assuming they don't want summer irrigation. That is usually, most of them are gonna be fine with that, generally speaking. Limited summer irrigation. I don't want to say no summer irrigation because they can survive, but a lot of them will shut down completely and they won't look good. But some of them you can't irrigate even in small quantities, and others you can irrigate in even large quantities. So it really is species specific. So I would say your best bet would be to, generally desert species can take summer irrigation on the whole. So if it's a desert species, you're pretty safe irrigating in summer. Your upland drought tolerant species that aren't in areas that receive, like seasonal flooding or anything like that, they don't want some heavy summer irrigation. Again, a light wash off is different, or a light sprinkling or something like that is not a big deal. But heavy duty rain is not what they want. So I would, it's not so much rainfall levels as think about maybe geography, like where do they come from? Are they on the hillsides? If they're on the hillsides of the San Gabriels, if they're on the hillsides of the Santa Monica Mountains, if they're on the hillside, like if they grow on a hillside, the likelihood that they're going to want number one to be sitting in water, number two for that environment wouldn't get the kind of summer irrigation from the sky. And so you just don't want to give them that artificially either, except in, like I said, those light applications don't usually hurt them. But if they're from like a river wash or something like that, where the likelihood that they receive flooding sometimes of the year, or they're on really low flatlands or anything like that, then they tend to have a little bit more flexibility with irrigation. And if they're riparian, they definitely have not flexibility, but a requirement for it. All right. Well, you got it. Great. You're welcome. And maybe see you tomorrow. If not, see you at the next Zoom. And Alice Ann, thank you very much.
Hi, Catherine.